Welcome everybody to our second webinar in our series with Cynomi and with the subject of CMMC. Today, the title of our webinar is Finding the Right Balance, Defining Your CMMC Scope. And we'll cover practical strategies to reduce complexity and prepare for certification. So today, joining me is Patrick Costello, Partner Manager for Cynomi. Patrick, would you like to take a second and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I work with current partners at Cynomi on both technical inside the platform or operating system that we have for our partners to help their clients on compliance journeys. But I also come from a background in the CMMC space. I've worked for a provider that was servicing defense contractors of all shapes and sizes. And one thing that I did quite a bit of in my 2 years at that organization was scoping environments or helping organizations seeking certification in scoping their environments. So
Great.
Thrilled to be on here today.
Thank you, Patrick. Also on with us providing support is Natalie Bertolotto from our sales and marketing department. And myself, Chris McEwen. I'm the CEO and founder of Xceptional. Xceptional has been around since 2007. We are a managed service provider, managed security service provider. We also are a value-added reseller. We design and build networks, cloud infrastructure, collaboration systems, as well as provide help desk, network operations, security operations, with a full suite of managed services, managed security services tools. Our webinar today, we're going to cover the topic of helping organizations understand how to define a manageable, defensible CMMC scope. And what you can expect is a business-focused, approachable session with practical guidance you can act on immediately. So with that, I'll progress to the next slide. Why does scoping matter? So scoping goes along with mapping of this confidential unclassified information, CUI, which we'll talk a little bit about. But basically, scoping is what defines what your CMMC journey looks like from many aspects. And Patrick, I'll let you cover the first two of cost and complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my audience might be limited, but I will argue with anyone that cares to listen that scoping is the most important part of CMMC, maybe aside from the assessment, but it dictates success in the assessment. Understanding what is in scope for the assessment, what is the assessor actually going to look at, what are we defining as in scope for this? And it directly impacts a few things. But the first two here being cost and complexity should not be understated. The more that's going to be involved in your scope, any assets that are storing, processing, transmitting CUI, the more there is, the higher the cost is likely going to be. There's a direct correlation to cost when increasing the size of the scope. In terms of complexity, same idea. A broader, larger scope creates more of an environment that you're going to have to control. And this might be a silly example, but if anybody listening has a lawn, if you have a smaller lawn that you have to mow, it's much easier to take care of in terms of the care and feeding that goes into that, as opposed to having 5 acres that you have to look after. It's much more expensive. It's much more complex. You may have to bring other folks in to help you with that. So maybe a silly example, but cost and complexity, definitely two big players. Yeah.
I love that example. I think I would double click on it actually and say that, a small patch of lawn that's just grass, obviously low level of complexity, right? Okay.
Sure.
I get out there, I mow the grass, and I throw the clippings away, I'm done, right? Versus a yard that has succulents and trees, and right, with trees come tree trimmings. With tree comes leave pickup, leaf pickup, and so on and so forth. So that's the complexity argument, right? If you can narrow your scope down to one or two systems that store, process, or store and process CUI, then obviously your complexity, your costs are lower. The I'll talk a little bit about timeline and audit readiness. So uh, uh, directly related to cost complexity would be the length of time it takes you to get audit ready, right? So if you have a highly complex, large scope, well, then you have to touch more systems, write more processes, train more people, and make more change, et cetera, et cetera. And so the timeline will elongate, right? With a deadline looming here, November 1st, there's not a lot of time to have a large scope. Connected to that, obviously, is audit readiness. If you have a smaller scope, it will take less of an effort to get audit ready. A well-defined scope, it says there, leads to smoother assessment experience. So when the assessor or the auditor is coming in to look at, okay, all the systems under the scope of CMMC that store, process, and handle CUI, well, then they can narrow their focus, achieve their result quicker, provide less of a punch list after the fact, et cetera, et cetera. So the quote there at the bottom is, the larger the scope, the larger the effort. Seems like a direct relationship. That's fairly obvious, but I've talked to a lot of clients who have just thrown in the towel and said everything's in scope. Large, 10,000 plus person organizations, everything in scope. Well, then they're gonna have to work on their CMMC effort for years and years and years. Versus, okay, if I just have this enclave, small group of users, small group of systems, shorter effort, lower cost, etc. What is CMMC scope? Well, we talked a little bit about this. Scope includes systems, people, assets that store, process, and transmit CUI. If something touches CUI, it belongs in scope, and not everything in your organization automatically does. Patrick, you want to take the next section here?
Yeah. So when we think about the CUI life cycle, if you will, or the data flow, which I know we'll get into, when we talk about CUI being stored, where is it at rest? Any systems or locations where it's saved, archived, or held? Any CUI that is processed is CUI in motion, right? Systems that are reading, editing, or acting on or behalf of CUI during operations, and then CUI in motion or transmit. Where is it coming? Where is it going? So, likely in transit, it's kind of how are we receiving it? And then after we get it, if it's leaving our organization, where is it going? So having an understanding of this and these three terms specifically are absolutely going to be instrumental in defining your scope, because this is the language that the assessors are trained to use. This is the language that's included in the actual legislation, 32 CFR. We're talking about storing, processing, and transmitting controlled unclassified information. And I love the principle here. It's simple. If it touches CUI, it matters. And again, that could be people, process, or technology. So there's a few things at play here.
So I've seen a lot of stories where okay, you map your flow of CUI and it determines scope is too large. Well, then perhaps the first step is modify your processes and procedures to limit that flow. For example, creating enclaves of CUI data that doesn't, separate from other data, doesn't touch. So mingling your data is a risky proposition, because if you have CUI alongside non-CUI, then the non-CUI all of a sudden becomes in scope for CMMC audit. So mapping your flow is the first step, and that's what we're trying to describe here. Obviously, this next slide covers start with your CUI data flow. So the foundational, this is the foundation of proper scoping, sort of repeating what I just said. Before tools, controls, or timelines, you must understand the movement of CUI. You cannot reduce scope unless you understand the data flow. So where does CUI come from? Identifying originating contracts, usually prime contractors or contractors that your organization works with as a client is going to be sending you or sharing with you CUI. What systems use that and what parties are sending it to you. Where does it live once you receive it? Where do you store it? Servers, cloud, endpoints, and the media. And where does it go? Who accesses it? How are you transmitting it? Because CUI does need to move, right? And then understanding the regulatory requirements around that CUI also, because there's different levels of that, right? Where you might have one client that is ITAR, International Trading in Arms, required to have tighter restrictions on their CUI flows or CUI storage than a non-ITAR CUI flow. And then what touches it? So what systems, what applications, what person interacts and touches that CUI is important to your flow. And before you define your scope, obviously you need to understand the flow. And in the CUI CMMC process, that's the first step. I'll let you take this one, Patrick.
Yeah, because it's, I would say in my experience working directly with just a variety of defense contractors, some very small machine shops all the way up to, a couple thousand person organizations that might have just a subset of users that were actually doing defense contract work. This is often the most difficult portion, unless you already have a very solid understanding of where CUI is going and living in the environment. I mean, 8.5 times out of 10, when I would start working with an organization, say, okay, let's talk about your CUI data flow. Where does it live in your organization? And I would get some blank stares or I don't know. So these, questions that are here on the screen are part of these practical takeaways, questions that you will be asked by someone who's helping you figure this out and define your CUI data flow. Very simply, just starting off at the top, where does it originate? How does it actually come into you? If you're working on a contract, who is sending you the CUI? How does it come in? Is it via email? Are you receiving physical CUI in the mail? That's kind of our first clue, right? And then following the path from there, who is opening it? Who has access to it? There might be an intended recipient, but let's say that file that gets sent is saved to a file server and everyone in the organization or multiple people in the organization have access to that file server. If they have permissions, they have access to that CUI, right? What systems touch it? Is it being, stored in your CRM, tied to the specific, company or customer that you're working with? Is it landing on a file server? Is it getting pulled into a backup appliance? The kind of possibilities are endless here. So it's important to be able to document, okay, where do we have all of this CUI going? What systems are touching it? And then does it leave our environment? If you're a part of a larger supply chain and the work that you're doing is, you know, directly involved with the work of the next person, if you're shipping things off to somebody else for additional, processing, for example, and you're sharing CUI yourself, you have to understand that as well. So if this is coming in from our customer and we're passing it along to somebody else, you have to understand that. An important, very important point here, not getting too deep into the tools, but does it pass through email or SaaS tools? Chris, you mentioned this briefly, but you have to understand the requirements associated with storing this type of data. And if you're processing this through a third-party tool that's accessed over the internet, or processing it via email, there might be a government type of license that you should be using that meets the requirements from DoD or Department of War for actually handling that type of information. So it's important to understand this, be able to answer these questions, and then once you have an idea of where we are, current state, then we can start to narrow the scope as much as possible and say, do these 15 people really need access to CUI, or could it be 5? Because if we can cut that down by 10 people and get this scope much tighter, to our earlier points, it's going to be an easier conversation for us and easier work to get ready for an assessment.
Thank you, sir. So what are the blind spots that are common? We mentioned this before. Many organizations unintentionally expand the scope, probably due to lack of understanding of CUI flow in their organization, or an assumption that everybody needs to be covered, right? Even indirect exposure matters. One unmanaged USB drive or personal device can pull additional systems into your assessment boundary. What are some examples of blind spots? Email systems. CUI sent via email brings the entire mail platform into scope, right? SaaS applications, third-party cloud applications that touch CUI require careful evaluation. We deal with this a lot in our business, right? Because we use a lot of cloud-based tools. Determining which ones are in scope and which ones are not is important to us. Shared file storage, so shared drives without CUI segmentation becomes an in-scope environment. I mentioned this earlier, where if you mingle non-CUI and CUI data, well, that whole thing then is now in scope. Remote workers, you have to deal with not only their workstations, but their home offices, their network, their everything with regard to the environment or the network that they're using to transmit or store or process CUI becomes in scope. So limiting the boundary there is important. So cloud, like for example, using virtual desktop infrastructure or SASE type solutions, secure access, secure edge, always on VPN, that kind of stuff would potentially limit your scope on home office networks. Physical media, so labeling, making sure you label USB drives or documents, etc., that store or carry CUI, labeling them CUI and storing them properly is important. And obviously, separate, not mingling non-CUI and CUI will narrow your scope a little bit, right? And then backup systems, Patrick mentioned this. If you're using backup systems to back up and store CUI, well, then that also becomes in scope. So just be aware of that.
Yeah, and just a couple examples here, just from my time in the field, if you will. The remote worker piece, yes, can absolutely be covered by technical solutions and configurations for the average worker. But I'm now remembering a company I worked with where they actually had a lot of physical CUI being brought to job sites. They were more in the construction and engineering space, and they had to have specific processes for their employees who were taking physical CUI out of their office, bringing it in their cars and bringing it home with them at night. So yes, technology absolutely plays a part in this, but if you're dealing with situations like that, it could also be process or policy related, where the onus is on the employee that's handling that to securely store it when it's physical media. And the other piece with backup systems, I have a background in disaster recovery and business continuity, and this question came up very often. Not saying don't back up CUI, but you need to be aware of what that backup process actually looks like. Is this are you replicating a file server, for example, to a physical backup device that is not replicating to any cloud? Because if that's the case, it's likely fine. Yes, it extends the scope a little bit, but it's sitting on your network. It's not talking to anything outside of it. Where with many backup tools that are available now, there's a cloud component. And in some cases, there's geo redundancy built in. So we're going to back up in this this cloud, and we're also going to replicate it to another cloud in case one goes down, because that's more secure. But you can start to see where this is extending your boundary from file server to backup appliance
Yeah.
to this cloud to that cloud. It becomes cumbersome and more difficult to have a defensible narrative around that.
So many of these conversations end up in a push-pull, right? So
Yeah.
when we talk about backup systems, we talk about the 3-2-1 rule, right? You need 3 copies of your data, 2 on-site, 1 off-site, right? And so that if you abide by the 3-2-1 rule in your backups, which you should, you need to be cognizant of the impact and storing and CUI in those systems has on the scope of your assessment.
Yeah.
All right. I'll let you take this one, Patrick.
Yeah, and this, I think, it was a great segue, unplanned but great segue nonetheless. This is we're giving examples that sometimes fall into the extremes, right? Overscoping or underscoping can create problems. You have to figure out what's going to work best for you and your business, given the current, people, process, and technology that you have that are going to be interacting with CUI. So the goal is not to build the smallest scope possible. It needs to be the right scope. You don't want to lock everything down so much that no one can actually do their work, or it's falls on the shoulders of 3 or 4 specific individuals. But you want to avoid having everything in scope. And I think questions that I would typically ask, and you can ask yourself as a business owner or somebody who's been charged with figuring out CMMC. How much of your revenue as a company is actually tied to defense contracts? Because if you're a 50-person organization, or I think we have an example that we're going to do later in the presentation, and 95% of the work you're doing is defense related, it may make sense to have everybody in scope. But if you're that same company and only 30% of your revenue is coming from defense contracts, not everyone needs access to it, and we can pare that down quite a bit. But the goal here with CMMC, as in life, is balance, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Here's the practical example. So this is a 100-person, 100-employee organization. Not every employee needs access to CUI. Not every system needs to be included. This is one of the biggest opportunities organizations have to reduce effort and cost. So the scenario A would be the entire company's in scope. That would be, I think, capitulation to the segmentation, right? Mountain you might need to climb. It sometimes is easier to say, harder to do, right?
Right.
With all employees assessed, all systems and devices included, maximum cost and complexity, and it will lengthen the documentation burden. Scenario B would be you create a subset or an enclave of employees that are segmented into a CUI environment. That the benefit of that is only CUI handling is only CUI staff handling is assessed. So you go from 100 employees and 100 employee systems and all the associated supporting systems and processes to down to the 12. You can create, I've been using the word enclave a lot, but an isolated controlled environment, right? Where the CUI lives, the CUI is stored, and the CUI is accessed and transmitted from or to. It will dramatically increase your cost and effort, and will create a focused it allows you to create focused, manageable documentation. So obviously here, scenario B is preferred if possible. To going back to the point that Patrick made, if CUI flows throughout your entire organization and a great majority of your revenue is tied to it, and everybody in the company or your organization stores and processes it, well then congratulations, you have a large in scope area. But if you can create these subsets and enclaves, then you can obviously shrink that a little bit, quite a bit
Yeah,
actually.
and I've had these conversations with folks too, where they may think, again, given the current process that they have and how many people are involved, that that's the way that they should approach this moving forward. And there's been a few times where, when I was in the, scoping and engineering seat, giving them the two options and saying, okay, well, you said it's actually only these 15 people, but you want all 100 in scope. Here's purely the licensing costs associated with getting everyone migrated into an email system that can accommodate this type of data flowing through it versus just doing that for the 12, 15 employees.
Yeah.
And in both examples I'm thinking about, the CFOs specifically and CEOs were like, yeah, let's go with option B.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. So one of the things I would say, we haven't mentioned it here yet, is understand your obviously the systems and applications and the people that store, process, transmit, CUI. But then for any of those things that involve third party companies or contractors, understand your shared responsibility matrix, right? So actually understand your shared responsibility, and you do that by requesting shared responsibility matrices from these providers, because many times you can reduce your scope by relying on your vendor or your contractor's shared responsibility and tapping into what the work that they've already done to be audit ready. And in your audit, you could say, well, this particular control is part of our shared responsibility matrix, and it's actually this vendor, and here's their documentation that proves that they're audit ready. And so you can reduce your cost because you're already paying for those vendors and partners. And if they're doing their due diligence and doing their obligation to their customers, then that will reduce your cost. So that is part of the scoping, even though it's not been mentioned, is understanding the shared responsibility matrices for your vendor ecosystem and making sure that you focus on the areas that you need to work on directly in order to be audit ready. Well, there's an example we've been talking about in a couple of different meetings and conversations. Is like you might have a vendor, a managed service provider, a managed security service provider that manages your Microsoft 365 environment. So a lot of the items that have to do with the controls that have to do with those systems would fall under your managed service provider and or Microsoft or whatever provider we're talking about. But things like that you control would be like physical access control, surveillance cameras, alarm systems, visitor logging, visitor chaperoning, those kinds of things. Obviously, very little chance that that's going to be covered by a vendor. It's most likely going to be covered by you yourselves. And so understanding that shared responsibility environment is important to understanding your scope as well.
Yeah,
Next
I
slide.
think like the just another analogy I think that will hopefully resonate with folks, because the lawn care analogy landed so well. Just in looking at these practical tips to reduce scope, I'm thinking about my family life or home life. We have a toddler who is at the age where she is opening lots of doors and cabinets, right? And under the sink is where my wife and I keep cleaning products. We don't want my toddler to be accessing cleaning products. We have the little, magnetic key that is kept high out of reach that opens that if we need access to it, right? But we're limiting where the harmful materials are stored, and we're limiting who has access to it, right? And maybe we have that downstairs where convenient in the kitchen and upstairs in a bathroom where convenient, but we have those controls in place in both locations. But when we look at separating corporate and CUI workflows, or in this case, it'd be like storing cleaning solution in the toy chest, right?
Mhm.
Like when we say that, it sounds like such a silly example. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I think the part of the issue for organizations who haven't gone through a process like this is CUI is this, nebulous thing that, yes, we know it's marked, but we don't know exactly where it's going, who has access to it. Like, I'm not really sure. But when you think about it in terms like that, you wouldn't want your toddler playing with a bottle of Windex, for example. You want that separated, and only the folks who are supposed to have access to that have access to it.
Gates at the top of the top or bottom of the stairway, same exact. Pool
100%.
fences, same analogy, right? Where in the pool fence analogy, those who are qualified and able to process and store and transmit CUI, they can get into the pool fence. So those people can swim. The folks that can't swim have to stay outside the pool fence. The non CUI, the corporate data, etc. So practical tips here: limit who can access. We've been talking about that, right? Restrict it to only those employees who need to have access to it. Limit where it's stored. Consolidate into a designated control repository, right? That has digital loss prevention, version control, lots of all the controls that are in the NIST 800-171. Segment your CUI environment. So keep the transmission in if you have a large network infrastructure, right? So segment it off so that you have the end user workstations, servers, storage, network infrastructure, CMMC compliant, but in a smaller footprint than the whole entire network. Separate corporate and CUI workflows. We've talked about this a lot. Mixing creates scope creep, and then reducing unnecessary applications touching CUI. So there's probably no reason for your HRIS system to touch CUI, right? There's probably no reason for your what's another good example? Your calendar to have CUI, but if you separate those two things out and have the enclave with only applications that are in scope that you're going through and analyzing the shared responsibility matrix and locking down the environment, it only makes sense to limit the number of applications or systems or people, etc., that have access to CUI. Any comment you want to make there, or should we go to the next slide? Okay.
That's perfect.
Scope directly impacts cost. So we've talked a little bit about this. This is where I think Patrick mentioned CFOs, executives start to pay attention. Every additional asset in scope increases implementation effort because your team and your consultants and your auditors have to touch more stuff. Usually, when you go out to talk to consultants and auditors, some of the first questions they're going to ask you is how many people do you have? How many sites do you have? Right, and what they're trying to do is gauge their effort to get you on the consultant side audit ready, and then on the auditor side, what the surfaces they're going to have to look at and audit to make sure that you're ready for it. More systems. Every additional device, server, application requires hardening and documentation, so that's more work. More controls. Each in-scope system must satisfy all applicable CMMC practice requirements. We talked a little bit about that. So there's a lot of those controls, 110 controls. If you have more systems, then you have more controls, right? And you have to apply those controls to all those systems. More documentation, policies, procedures, and evidence must cover every in-scope asset. So I think that's key. And there might be separate procedures or policies for separate assets. So just keep that in mind. And more validation. I talked a little bit about this. Assessors must verify in-scope element during this third-party audit assessment. And so, you need to be aware of if you have mingling, you have too many users, you have too many systems, too many applications with access to CUI, your costs will spiral up. And every unnecessary system in scope costs time and money. So if you just repeat that to yourself over and over again, that will help you sort of limit your scope.
It's a good call on the actual assessment process too. The cyber AB that oversees the assessors, they don't hide this. It's public information. There is an actual assessment guideline document that they publish for the third party assessors, and one of the first things that a C3PAO is going to do pre-assessment is understand the CMMC scope that they're going to be assessing. So before the clock actually starts and they're going to start the assessment process, they're having a discussion with the organization seeking certification. What information systems are we assessing? What personnel are in scope? What contractual requirements do you actually have? Like, they're asking these questions before they even get started. So that's kind of like test number one, is that you actually know this is what is going to be assessed.
Right.
And I think a lot of, like, I haven't personally sat through an assessment, but from the assessors I know and I've had conversations with, it does become more of a narrative and a story that the organization is telling them, right? Like, there's the implementation of the controls. It's very black and white, but it's how are we implementing these controls, satisfying these requirements given our scope and our situation, our company. And I think we've used the word defensible a few times. You have to be able to have a defensible narrative to back up what you're saying in your documentation. And this is quite literally the foundation that everything is built upon. So extremely important.
Yeah, and you're gonna make assertions that they're gonna question, right? And so make sure you have backup for your assertions with regard to the decisions you make about where is CUI and how big is your scope. I'll let you take this one, Patrick. Are you there? Do you hear me? I'll let you
Yeah.
take this one.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've touched on a few of these at a high level, or some in a bit more detail. But common mistakes that I've seen, Tris and his team have seen, including everything just to be safe. This is not really an exercise where that is going to bode well for you, right? It's going to increase the complexity. It's going to increase the cost. Incomplete data flow understanding. Again, this is the first thing that you should be doing if you have not done this. Like, where is it coming from? Who has access to it? Where is it going inside the organization? 'Cause oftentimes, if you're asking someone for help, a consultant, a managed service provider, anyone who's going to come in and try and help you on this journey, they're going to be asking you the same questions. You have to have an understanding of where things are living and going. Indirect exposure. We touched on this a few times. Systems that don't directly store CUI but connect to those that do may still fall within scope. So I would say example of that is, again, like we touched on, like HR systems, for example. They may not be explicitly storing CUI, nor should they be. But one component that comes into play is background checks, right? Are you providing, screening on employees? Oftentimes that is kept inside of an HR system, right? So it could still be, in scope for the assessment, even though it's not something that's storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. So again, having an understanding of some of those pieces is
A
important.
good example of that in our business, Patrick, is
Yeah,
remote monitoring and management tools, right? Or
100%.
security tools, right? So remote monitoring and management tools, yes, there's an agent running on that workstation that might be in scope, but the system itself isn't storing, right? But it isn't storing any CUI, but it has access to a system that is storing and
Right.
or processing CUI. So, those systems can
Exactly.
be in scope as well.
Exactly. And, I think this is specific to this presentation and scoping example, but I think this is something that applies to just risk management and governance in general. Treating this as a one-time exercise. The CMMC program, the assessment process, everything that's been done in legislation, it was designed to get away from the notion that this is a one-time snapshot type of deal. Like, get your documentation in order, get your ducks in a row, sit for an assessment, you get a gold star. Congratulations, you never have to do this again. It is a living, breathing document, your system security plan, that is going to change and hopefully improve over time as your process and policy is expanding over time. Maybe you're taking on new clients, new projects, there's different requirements that you hadn't had to deal with before. It's something that's consistently going to be updated. So, part of the process is reviewing some of these things on a quarterly basis, annual basis, et cetera, as a team to say, okay, this is what we had before. Has this changed? Do we need to update our documentation to reflect that?
Yeah. I think the great point, and I think I'll double click on it a little bit, is that we talked about CFO's particular interest in the cost of assessment, but what also should be included when you're having a scoping conversation or deciding what your scope is the long-term cost, right? So it might cost you more, yes, to have a large scope up front, but then if your scope is too broad, then the controls are applied to too many processes or people or systems. Well, then your costs increase not only to go through assessment, but also to keep current and to just to do your normal business, right? If you are included in scope but don't need to be, but the rigor of the security controls and processes and procedures that we put on a system that's on the border or on the edge of needing to be in scope, well, then your organization increase the cost, the cost of ownership and cost of operation of those assets and those people. So just keep that in mind as you're having these scoping conversations. What assessors will look for. Patrick talked a little bit about that. Keep this practical, not intimidating. Assessors want to understand where CUI exists, how it moves, how the environment is controlled, and preparation around these 4 areas makes it go smoothly. So defining clear boundaries, we've talked about this. Labeling things, creating subsets of systems or processes that are CUI specific will go a long way to narrowing your scope. Defining systems and users, right? An inventory of every in-scope system and a list of every user with access to CUIs needs to be created at assessment time and then maintained and audited, to Patrick's point earlier, on a quarterly or annual basis. Documenting the data flow. How does CUI flow through your organization? An example is a manufacturer might receive CAD drawings or plans on a particular thing they need to create for the either the prime contractor or the Department of War directly. They'll receive those things from the government or from the contractor, documenting how they enter your organization, how they are accessed in your organization, how they're stored in your organization, and then how they're transmitted back to the client. All that matters. All that needs to be documented. And then being consistent, handling in your handling practices. How do you label? How do you store? How do you what are the policies and procedures around those things are incredibly important as well. All right. And the assessors will be looking for all those four things as they start to gauge, whether or not what you say is your scope is in fact your scope. All right. Wrapping up here, key takeaways. Patrick, why don't you take this one?
Yeah. We've covered everything in great detail, and hopefully we have some questions from folks. But again, there is there's a direct correlation between the size of the scope and the cost of that implementing CMMC, getting ready for an assessment is going to have. And all of that starts with the foundation of understanding your CUI data flow. I cannot understate that. Um, Not everything belongs in scope, right? This idea of inclusion by default or all in, it may work for some folks, it may not work for others. We gave you some practical, questions you should be asking to help you figure that out. What is going to be the right balance for us? And a company like Xceptional can help you with that. Having those conversations to figure out what is going to be the most feasible given your current situation. Um, in most cases, maybe not on the fringe, but a smaller intentional scope is easier to manage. Having a well-defined boundary is going to be easier to secure, document, and defend during an assessment. The more complex something is, the more levers an assessor has to pull and poke and prod and try and figure out, okay, well, what about this? What about that? This isn't connected to this system. Whatever the case may be, you're just opening yourself up to more questions, and more complexity down the line. And last piece. Some folks have already gone through this process. Maybe a reminder that even if you've gone through a CUI data flow exercise and you've documented that over the last year plus, might be time to just go back and validate that that's still accurate. Because having those scoping conversations early on and starting with the mindset of, okay, one of the first things that we're going to be asked when we sit down for an assessment is what is in scope for the assessment. We need to figure that out so then we can build everything around that. And we say foundational because to keep the metaphors rolling. It's like the foundation of a house, right? Everything is contingent upon that foundation being strong. If there are cracks in the foundation, water is going to find its way in, right?
Yeah. I think I would add another takeaway there too, is that a lot of organizations we were talking to believe that they won't have to go through audit or assessment, right? That their customers, whether it be the government or their prime contractors, have not presented them, have told them they need to be CMMC level 2, but haven't necessarily said they need to be audited. I don't think you should think of the differentiation of those two things as any different as far as what your effort needs to be, right? My recommendation would be, if you don't have to go through audit today, it doesn't mean you won't have to go through audit tomorrow, and you should be audit ready no matter what, right? And so it's a good idea to do a mock assessment, even if you don't have to do an official assessment, just so that if that changes in the future, let's say today you feel like, well, I can self attest to my level 2. If you've not done a mock audit, then you're in jeopardy of being out of compliance and getting into trouble for falsely claiming that you're CMMC level 2. So
Yeah, we don't have to spend too much time on it, but that is the reality. Prior to CMMC, actually going live and the certifications being required. The idea of self attestation has been around for years, since 2017, right? And the issue is that many organizations self attested to the fact that they were perfect or they were much more well off than they
right.
were in reality. And the false claims, you know, issue is something that's becoming more and more prevalent. Right now, mostly with larger organizations or universities, we've seen, False Claims Acts and like actual legal action being taken by the
Yep.
government. But there's also a report from a few years ago, that the DoD CIO put out, where they looked at organizations that had been breached, that all had self-reported that they were 110, or had this great
Yeah.
score, and when they actually went and looked at it, they were nowhere near
Right.
close.
Right.
So again, I think being prepared and using that as a differentiator, as well, is going to be important. And I think, if I was in the seat of a defense contractor that was evaluating 4 or 5 suppliers, and I saw 3 that were CMMC level 2 certified by an assessor and 2 that were self-attested to being compliant, I would be looking much more closely at those 3 who had gone through the certification process than the 2 who just said, "Yeah,
Right.
we've done it."
Yeah, because if you self-attest and you falsely claim that you're compliant and you're not, there's liability there, legal liability
Yeah,
there, that money and even worse, with regard to what can happen. So just note, I mean, some of you
yeah.
may be able to self-attest. If you do, take it just as seriously as if you're going to be assessed or audited. With that, I think, Natalie, I'll open it up for any questions that have come in from the audience. If you have any.
Yeah, so in regards to data flow documentation, how detailed does data flow documentation need to be?
Patrick, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think something, I would say broadly, something is better than nothing, right? If it's a rudimentary diagram where you're kind of documenting, hey, most of our CUI comes in via email, it goes in, maybe you have it segmented to a specific mailbox that only a couple of people have access to. It could be documented that way. There's also kind of like a network diagram component, that could, is going to come into play at some point. So I would say be as detailed as you can, given your level of comfortability and just the amount of time that you have. I think you'll get to a point where it has to be much more tightly scoped and defined, but just to get started, it is something that you can continue to iterate on. But Chris, what are your
I think
thoughts?
well, I would apply a pretty standard file system security principle here, right? So that if you have groups or folders, whatever construct that flows its security controls down to lower levels, then keep the CUI flow documentation at that upper hierarchical level, because you don't need to go down and detail every single folder structure or every single group structure underneath the master
Sure.
group that has the flow down, right? So keep it at the level at which it flows down, because that will obviously keep it from having to catalog every single file, every single folder, every single group, every single user. If you just say any member of this folder, any subfolder of this folder, or any member of this group, then you can keep it at the group or upper level folder level, and not have to go all the way down to the nth degree and detail.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Another question is, who internally should own scoping decisions?
I
Mm.
think security officer, right? So whoever who sits in the role of security officer owns it, but they might be dependent on subject matter experts on their teams. But I don't know, Patrick, unless you have a different opinion on that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Security officer, or another term we see thrown around is affirming official. Somebody who's identified to basically take ownership of this, because ultimately, I think that the buck does stop with whoever that person is, and you may
Yep.
delegate responsibilities to other folks in the organization because you don't know the answers. Um, but I would say in most cases, whoever is leading the charge is not going to have the answers to everything, right? There's going to be different departments involved, even if it's a small organization. I think sometimes it's even more difficult when it's a small organization because Chris has been doing something his way for 25 years and he doesn't want to change this process, and you have Kevin over here, same thing, but he prefers a completely different method. Everybody's got to work together to come to an understanding. So I think it starts much like kind of the kind of hierarchy of inheriting access or responsibilities. It starts at the top, and you're going to
Right.
delegate folks
I would
moving down.
simple answer is whoever is personally liable.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're personally liable for false claims, then you need to own your decisions and all the decisions beneath you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So our last question is, where do we start with trying to figure out if we have CUI?
Well, your clients, perhaps conversation with your clients. If you're in this industry or one of these industries, and you work with clients that have not reached out and told you they expect you to be CMMC compliant, then your clients are behind the eight ball, and I would be reaching out to them and asking them. The government and government contractors are supposed to be stamping CUI in email and hard copies, and so that if you start to see those stamps on the data you're receiving from your clients, well, then that's a good indication. Although I would think the conversations and the notifications would be happening much sooner. I've had clients that have come to me that have in no way received, store, or transmitted CUI, and their customers are coming to them and saying, what is your status on CMMC? So, both can be true, right? You could have responsibility that you don't know about, and you could be asked to claim responsibility that you don't have to. So just know. You need to know your environment. You need to know the business that you're in and know the data that you're receiving and storing. If you don't know, you obviously reach out to us. We're there for you if you need help, but also reach out to your clients. Right? Understand your clients, your prime contractors. Talk to them, ask them, because the responsibility flows from the government to the prime contractor, and from the prime contractor down to the subs. So most of you out there are probably going to be subs. Most of you are probably not going to be prime contractors, but your prime contractor should be telling you, basically. Patrick, did you have anything else to add to that?
The only other place I've seen it is on there's a form DD 254. It's a Department of Defense form, and I believe there is a box. Like if you're participating in one of those contracts, again, it might vary depending on if you're prime or a sub. But it would essentially say like this is the type of data that you're going to be receiving or potentially receiving as part of this contract, and CUI will be listed on there.
Yeah.
I believe moving forward, the solicitations are going to be much more clear as to what
Right.
data is going to be involved and what level you're going to need to be. But yeah, I think CUI mismarking, overmarking, not marking at all. That's been an issue that's kind of plagued the defense industrial base for the last few years. So I think it'll get better, but just ask.
The
Ask for help.
government's going to be very clear with their requirements for their prime contractors. They're going to be
Yes.
very clear. And so those prime contractors should also be very clear to their subs. But if they're not, then it's on you to go and ask them in the end.
Yep.
Right on.
Perfect.
Well, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. It's been a pleasure. And Look forward to further conversations. Patrick, thanks again. Natalie, thank you. Until next time.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.